Hi, I'm Jackie Bellamy-Zions at Equine Guelph, and today I have with me Dr. Wendy Pearson, Associate Professor at the University of Guelph, and Dr. Nadia Golestani, PhD candidate. They have been looking at spirulina as a nutraceutical that could be beneficial to hardworking horses. So, Dr. Pearson, before we get into studies on spirulina, what's the difference between supplements that just make expensive urine and nutritional supplements, period, that could actually have an impact on horse health?
That is the million-dollar question. There are so many nutraceutical products on the market today that it is virtually impossible for even somebody like me who spends my life looking at nutraceuticals. It's virtually impossible to look at a label of one product and tell the difference between that and the product on the shelf right next to it. So really the only sort of, if I can even say, the only hint that we could have as horse owners is to look beyond the label, look beyond the bucket, and look to the manufacturer and start asking the difficult questions. Those questions are, has research been done on this particular product? Now, lots of companies will talk about the fact that they're science-based, but if you peel off a layer or two, you find that, in fact, the science they're talking about is science that other researchers have done on ingredients that show up on the label on their product. And that's the vast majority of, if I can say, science-based products that are out there in the marketplace. So unfortunately, it's up to the consumer to ask those questions of the manufacturer, find out, does this manufacturer actually do research on their products in the target species? And beyond that, there's very little that we can do to really guide evidence-based type decisions when we're at the tack shop. You can imagine that research is very expensive, and without the generous research funding, for example, that we get from Equine Guelph, it is very, very expensive to do these studies, and so for that reason, they're often not done. So it is really to the benefit of the consumer, and by consumer I mean the horse person, to go and ask those questions of their favorite manufacturers and find out which ones of them are actually conducting research, and then supporting those manufacturers. Because ultimately what that does is it means that other manufacturers that are not yet doing research on their products, now they have an economic reason to do so, if the consumer is really looking for those types of products.
Are nutraceuticals gaining popularity in feed programs?
I mean, the short answer is yes, but there is a longer answer to that. I mean, I first started doing research on nutraceuticals for horses in 1997. And at that time, it just simply wasn't a thing. It was nutraceuticals. And in fact, I don't even know that the word was really even that well known back then. We talked about feed additives and novel ingredients, but nutraceuticals wasn't really a common word at that point. If we're looking kind of on that time span, it's night and day different, because now it's, compared with back then, it's literally commonplace. There are many market studies out there that show that upwards of 80% of horse owners are adding something to their horse's diet, whether that something is electrolytes or nutraceuticals or herbal supplements, or there's a huge number of things that people are adding. So again, the short answer, yes, absolutely. It's gone from being some sort of fringe type, that only peculiar people are adding things, to now it's kind of unusual not to.
And how can horse owners ensure they're investing in quality supplements?
Is by doing your homework and not just looking at a label, and look at the company and ask those hard questions. Ask to see the research on the product. And I think that's our best bet at making sure that the products that we're buying are what we actually think we're buying.
Mm. And what are the precautions horse caretakers should be aware of before adding supplements to a horse's diet?
I think it's critically important to involve the vet. And not to say that most vets are experts in nutraceuticals. I think it's fair to say that most vets are not experts in nutraceuticals, but vets are experts in animal health and maybe more specifically animal disease. So, I think it introduces a lot of potential for problems if horse owners are, for example, they've got a horse with I don't know, laminitis, let's say. And so instead of talking to the vet, they just go and buy a supplement for it. That's, I think, the worst case scenario. And I think that, using these products can potentially delay proper veterinary care when they're not used properly. So this is not intended to be an opportunity for horse people to start to self-diagnose and self-treat disease. I think that's a really important point to make. Where these products are best positioned is when it's in conversation with the vet and that the vet is taking control of the care of these animals. But these products can often be a really helpful adjunct to really improving health outcomes in horses that have issues. So some of the precautions I think are, number one is to make sure that you are involving your vet. So that would be number one. Number two would be make sure you're buying from a company who actually does do research on their products and doesn't just claim to be science-based. Another thing that horse owners could do is, again, this goes into investigating the manufacturer, but you could look for manufacturers that have third-party sort of quality assurance, like HACCP, for example, Hazard Analysis and Quality Critical Control Point, as well as ISO 22000, in addition to GMPs, which is Good Manufacturing Practices. So those kinds of things can be helpful too. But ultimately, the sort of short answer to the long question is two things: involve your vet and do your homework on your manufacturer.
And I'm glad you said not to just haphazardly add things, because people just grab something on the shelf with the flashy marketing and they haven't even done a forage test sometimes to know how to balance the diet properly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Golestani, with all the joint supplements on the market, what prompted this study investigating spirulina?
So basically, we had a lunch meeting with Wendy, Dr. Pearson, and then with Ralph Robinson, which was the sponsor. So I got a generous offer when I started my master's. I got an award from his company. And then we had a launch meeting, and he brought me a book. So that honestly opened my eyes to the potential of a spirulina supplement, because the book was about the spirulina, and he was so interested and he believed in spirulina as a future food. So I started reading that book, and then I was so motivated by his idea. So I began exploring the ways to bring it to the exercise physiology. Then we talked with Wendy, and then she kind of guided me through the controversial topic that antioxidants in the basically equine health are so controversial, and the role of antioxidants in exercise and recovery. So I started going into her lectures in equine exercise physiology almost 4 years ago, and then I figured out that antioxidants are so they're so controversial even in athletes or horses, and we don't have enough that information about that if antioxidants are good for exercise performance or not. So I started writing the proposal, and we got the tax with the help of Selected Bioproduct Inc. company, and also the generous award that generous grant that we got from Equine Guelph. So we expanded that to see the effects of spirulina in protecting mostly the joint health. And we designed this study to get interest from the horse owners, but also athletes too.
Dr. Golestani, can you also let us know a little bit more about what spirulina is?
So spirulina is gaining more attention these days. Now, even if you look at some new supplements or protein supplements, it's using even in the humans too. It's a blue-green algae that it's used as a superfood. It's a dense nutritional profile too. It has 60 to 70% of amino acids. It has B vitamin. It has iron, vitamin E, essential fatty acids like GLA or gamma-linolenic acid. But we focused on the antioxidant parts of it, which is phycocyanin and beta-carotene.
This is not new, and I think Nadia, she illustrates that point. I mean, we've been using spirulina in not just human athletes, but in equine athletes as well. So this isn't a new thing. But what is new is the fact that people have been feeding it because, well, hey, maybe it'll do something. Now we're actually finding out what actually does it do. We've got antioxidants that are promoted to be beneficial in athletes, whereas we're starting to see data that actually completely contradict that. That in fact, in many cases, antioxidants can be detrimental to athletes, and mainly because they interfere with tissue adaptation to exercise stress. So what I mean by that is the training effect. And so we're starting to see data come out, not just from our lab, but from other research labs as well, that, you have to be very careful how you apply these antioxidants when you're talking about athletic animals, whether they're humans or horses or dogs or whatever they are. So I think that's what's really unique about Nadia's work that she's been doing is it's not so much that the nutraceutical itself is novel, but to just really peel off the layers and start to understand what is the best application for this product so that you're optimizing equine performance. And that's what's new.
That leads me nicely into my next question. Some inflammation is normal after exercise and protects structures as they recover from a workout. But when it becomes excessive, it can actually disrupt recovery. Can you explain this process further and the findings in the Spirulina study that suggest it may be useful in managing inflammation?
The thing about inflammation is pretty straightforward, right? Transient inflammation is good. As long as that transient inflammation isn't outrageously upregulated, it's pretty important to have it. In fact, it's more than that. If you don't have transient inflammation following exercise, you don't have that adaptation response. So transient inflammation is good, and we don't want to mess with that. But what isn't good is chronic sustained inflammation. And that's really what we're trying to kind of address here with this research is that we want to see, can we do something about the way tissue responds to an exercise bout without interfering with inflammation?
Yeah, so basically, we tested some biomarkers that were associated with the inflammation, like nitric oxide, prostaglandin E2, and resolvin D1. And we figured out that the nitric oxide, both in the blood plasma and the synovial fluid, was going a bit high. And then we saw that the resolvin D1, which is a mostly like a recovery biomarker, it's in the group that had consumed the spirulina for 30 days, it was a bit higher too. So that kind of bring us to the conclusion that nitric oxide, which is good for the blood flow and it's increasing the vasodilation, it's good. And also that the resolvin D1, because it's increasing, it means that the tissue is recovering and it's going to support that recovery process that we have after inflammation.
So the whole point is that spirulina is going to augment recovery from exercise without interfering with the inflammation that's needed for that recovery. Right. So the whole point of inflammation following exercise is to challenge tissue, right? You want stress, you don't want distress. So this is really a way to stress the tissue, and so that the tissue responds by becoming stronger.
Inflammation is also associated with oxidative stress, and this study reveals spirulina may be able to enhance performance through enhanced oxygen delivery in the blood, boosting both energy and endurance. Can you elaborate on how this works, Dr. Golestani?
So when a horse goes through the exercise, basically, there's the mitochondria is working there, and there's some reactive oxygen species that are a byproduct of this mitochondria. So that's going to work, and it's all about the balance. So reactive oxygen species, or ROS, is good for the body, as we talked about it earlier today. But if that amount is higher than the balance, is more producing more ROS, then we have the oxidative stress. And oxidative stress itself, it's going to trigger the inflammation. And this is like a cycle. So inflammation is going to affect the oxidative stress, and oxidative stress going to affect the inflammation again. When we had the spirulina, we figured out that the nitric oxide, it's again going to vasodilate, or in another way, it's going to relax the body vessels and improve the body flow. And also the resolving D1, which is going to resolve that inflammation that if it's going on, and it's going to affect our oxidative stress. So when the resolving D1 is going to get higher, then it's going to protect the tissue, and it's going to progress that recovery after exercise that it's happening. So basically, if after exercise you have the inflammation, resolving D1 in the group that we had the spirulina went higher, and it's going to bring that inflammation down sooner. So it's going to protect the oxidative stress in that cycle.
Well, I think the other important point here is that you also had an increase in hemoglobin and hematocrit, which are key in oxygen delivery, right? So horses that received the spirulina had a significant increase in both of those outcomes. As well as, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Nadia, you also had an increase in glucose, right? Blood glucose?
Yes, so 8 hours after exercise, in a normal group, we had a drop in the glucose, but with the group of spirulina, we didn't have that drop. So it has more glucose in presence, which is good after exercise, because then they can use it to bring more energy, like have more energy to use that glucose after exercise.
Okay. And what's the relationship between strenuous exercise and early onset of equine arthritis?
So strenuous exercise, it's basically when it's high impact, it's going to stress the joint. And over time, stress is going to break down the cartilage, and it's going to, it might lead to the chronic inflammation. And this chronic inflammation can be an early onset of arthritis. So that basically, if like it can happen in exercise horsing, if they're exercising and like, or performing horses in a races. So that's why we have osteoarthritis there. So a strenuous exercise, it's going to also increase that oxidative stress when we have the intense exercise. So mitochondria is basically working hard to meet the energy demands of muscles and producing more ROS, and RS was a bioproduct of the mitochondria, right? So then we have the oxidative stress, which is the imbalance of this RS production and the body's antioxidant defense. And this imbalance is going to damage the cells, proteins, lipids in the joint tissue, and therefore we're going to have an early onset of arthritis, maybe.
I mean, I think it goes back to that idea of stress versus distress. And we see this in human athletes too, that moderate intensity exercise is very good for protecting cartilage structure. But when you have repeated bouts of strenuous or very high intensity exercise, that can sort of tip the scales, right? Now you're getting more breakdown of cartilage than you have time to resynthesize. And as Nadia said, you've got a lot of, pretty elegant biochemistry going on there that's trying to facilitate tissue turnover. But when turnover starts to lean more towards tissue breakdown and synthesis can't keep up, that's when you start to see a declining in structural integrity of the tissue. And again, we see this in humans too.
Mm.
So one other thing that I might want to add, which I think is so important, it's also the insufficient time between the workouts or the exercise too. So many people in the horse industry, they're going to exercise the horses or perform their horses in the races so back to back. So it's going to bring some insufficient time between the workouts, and then your joint is going to overwork. So if they have like an adequate times to give the recovery after that exercise, then it might be protecting the early arthritis too.
And what's considered adequate time?
$1 million question. And I think a lot of the answer to that is very unsatisfyingly is it depends. It depends on the horse. It depends on the type of activity. It depends on the duration of the activity, the intensity of the activity, how well skilled the horse is at actually performing that activity, fitness level as well. So there isn't a nice, tidy answer to that, unfortunately.
Also, paying more attention to the behavioral changes of the horse, I should say. So behavior is so important. That's how you can figure out if, like, caring about the behavior and monitoring those behaviors to see how your horse is reacting to each exercise bout.
Can you explain the findings for spirulina to promote joint health and the delay of the onset of arthritis then?
So the most important one that I was emphasizing was Resolving D1 because the results were beautiful, like the errors were so less. So again, Resolving D1 is a bioactive lipid mediator derived from omega-3 fatty acid. It's so important in resolving the inflammation and promoting the clearance of inflammatory cells. And it's so important for the tissue repair. So the key finding that we had was that the Resolving D1 in both joint and plasma in the group that had a spirulina significantly rised. So that is highlighting how a spirulina has the potential to enhance this natural resolution pathway, and it's going to protect the inflammation and to promote the cartilage protection. Also, I think nitric oxide was a great biomarker that we did. Again, NO is important to bring the oxygen to the joint and do some vasodilation there, and not also joint but also muscles too.
The Resolvin was what got me super excited about that. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, transient inflammation is good and important. But the problem becomes when that transient inflammation becomes chronic. And so what Resolvin does is it prevents that development of chronic ongoing inflammation. So to have a compound or a feed ingredient that you can feed that will really significant, I mean, it was not a small effect. This was a very marked effect on Resolvin, that the horses receiving the spirulina had a pretty dramatic increase in Resolvin. So this is pretty strong evidence that you're protecting these horses from these bouts of transient inflammation from becoming chronic.
Dr. Pearson, what's next in the future studies for nutraceuticals and spirulina?
Well, what's next in spirulina? Boy, it's there's a lot of questions that, I mean, like any research, right? You do some research and you answer a few questions, but you get, a whole bunch more questions pop up. One of the things that I'm really interested in is, okay, we looked at what happens with spirulina specifically in blood, and we looked at it in cartilage, well, more specifically in synovial fluid. I want to know what's happening in the muscle. So, if we can see these kinds of effects that we see in blood and in cartilage tissue, if we see those sorts of effects in muscle, that has really significant implications for equine athletes. So for me, that's where I would be going next, is to start looking at effects of spirulina in muscle. What do you think, Nadia? I mean, you're closest to it. If you were going to do another 3 years of research on spirulina, what would you do?
Hard to answer, honestly. I'll say I really want to focus even on the spirulina oil. I know that it's gaining more interest. So I want to see if these effects are mostly for, because we just tested the spirulina. We didn't test phycocyanin individually or test the omega-3 or omega-6. So I want to know if these effects that we're getting, it's basically because of the omega-3, omega-6 that spirulina has, or is it basically for the phycocyanin and antioxidant properties that it has? Also, I'm interested to see the more long-term effects of it. So I want to see if 60 days of supplementing them is different than 30 days, or if we're going to have more results if it is longer or not.
Sounds like a lot of exciting research yet to be done with nutraceuticals and with spirulina. Thank you both for joining me and sharing your expertise.